intrigued. It's great to be with you all. Just to share a little bit about myself, my name is Father Wesley Owens. I am originally from Richmond, Virginia, but I've been around the block. I studied at the University of Virginia for my undergrad, went to Oxford for seminary, then I was curate at St. Peter's Cathedral in Florida, Tallahassee, and now I have the privilege of leading a church plant that meets on campus at Penn State University. So I'll share a little bit about our context. I'm pastor of Incarnation Church. We meet on campus at Penn State in Penn State Spiritual Center. State College is a very unusual context in which to do ministry. As the name suggests, it is in every sense a university town, and the university is the lifeblood of the community. There are about 60,000 or so permanent residents and about 50,000 students, with another 5,000 to 10,000 support staff and professors and such. And so, as you can imagine, this time of year, the town feels quite different. We are a context that is very much wedded to the university calendar, the academic calendar. And so we go through these ebbs and flows where we have lots of students. It feels like a small city, very energetic. And then summers where it's very much like rural Pennsylvania, small town life. And so it's an interesting place for other reasons. State College is an international community surrounded by rural farmland. And so we're in the part of Pennsylvania that sometimes jokingly gets called Pennsyltucky, because it's sort of this extension of Appalachia that moves up right to the center of the state. And so it makes for a very interesting place of many contradictions. Now, we're also a town that is highly religious. And by highly religious, of course, I don't mean Christian, I mean the religion of Penn State football, which is very much a religion. I use that word very intentionally. Just recently, the university announced plans to make a $700 million renovation of the stadium. And in order to do that, they were willing to take on a significant amount of debt. Meanwhile, there are assistant professors who barely make a living wage. So what is our context like? Well, it's this place where you have people from all over the world coming together to learn, to study. It is a secular university, and yet, unlike some secular universities, it's a space that has been, for the most part, amenable and friendly toward Christians, toward people of faith. And we inhabit a space called the Pascarilla Spiritual Center. It is Pascarilla rather than Pasqueria because it's an Italian word. In any case, we have access to the historic chapel in the Spiritual Center. This is the largest multi-faith center of its kind in the United States, as far as I and the director of the Spiritual Center are aware. And so I like to joke that because we have our worship services at the chapel, we have our church office in the Spiritual Center, we don't pay a dime for any of it. I'm kind of like a holy parasite. I get to inhabit this space and reclaim all of these resources for the work of the gospel, and do so alongside other sincere Christians. Now, I wanted to share just a little bit about our context, because of course, being a church that meets on a college campus, we're very young. In many ways, we're an upside down church. We're a church of young people, largely students, that in some ways is trying to get more of a reach off campus and establish more of a rootedness, more of a long-term stability in the community. And yet that challenge brings with it many opportunities. We are right in the center of student life, and we have students who probably would not ever set foot in a church if it was not for our small but very intentional presence there. And by God's grace, we've seen a number of people, students and some non-students, either return to faith after a period of wandering or decide for the first time, having been unchurched, that they want to follow Jesus. And so we have a history of baptisms in our church. We just celebrated an adult baptism this past February and a number of confirmations just after Easter. So being a church that ministers to a lot of young people, I've learned to appreciate the unique situation that we're in as a culture and the challenges that it poses for evangelism. Now, I'm a younger millennial, and I'm about 30 years old. In case you haven't realized, there are some new generations on the block. Gen Z is already almost fully into the workforce and out of high school and through college, but not quite there yet. And then we have Gen Alpha hot on their heels, just about ready to start college in a few years. And there are a few things that I've noticed. Some of this is based on research that I've read, but also anecdotal experience. And one of the things that was characteristic of my generation in college, and I noticed this as a student, was that it was very much a post-Christian environment, or an environment that was marked by a cynicism, a celebration of deconversion narratives, and a kind of celebration of casting off the fetters of old institutions and such. And we are very much now living in a context that lives with the fruit of that. But in some ways, what I've noticed is that this decade, in some ways, it's very different. There is a crisis of meaning as more and more students are waking up to the reality that we have this vacuum left behind by these old Christian institutions as they've, in a sense, been driven out of the public sphere. And society hasn't really come up with a better answer, has it? And on top of that, we have the dynamics of rapid technological change, more rapid and more pervasive perhaps than at any other point in history, except maybe the first industrial revolution. And so in some ways, it can feel more at times like ministering in a pre-Christian context than a post-Christian context. I notice that many of the students that come through our doors or come to me are either coming from an evangelical context that has been very theologically anemic, or in other cases, coming to us completely unchurched, and are interested in discovering what it means to follow Jesus, almost from a fresh and from a fresh perspective, without having had any previous influence speaking into them. Now, one thing we notice is that young people, in many ways, and I alluded to this a bit when I mentioned Penn State football, I would say are more religious than ever. Now, that's a bit of a paradoxical way of thinking, but what I'm referring to is something that philosopher Charles Taylor called the Nova effect. In his book, A Secular Age, Charles Taylor, the philosopher, talks about how with the rising tides of secularization, what we don't have is sort of the mere absence of Christianity or religious mindsets from society. Secularization didn't mean a wandering into a kind of post-religious world where, as people like Richard Dawkins might have wanted, we had this world of pure reason where everyone is just setting aside the supernatural and what they view as superstitious. No, actually, what you have, paradoxically, is this explosion, this proliferation of alternative spiritualities. And that very much is characteristic of Gen Z. I'm anticipating probably even more so of Gen Alpha. Everyone wants to distinguish themselves. Everyone wants to carve out a unique identity for themselves within this homogenous world of pop culture, mass culture, consumer culture. And that's led to some interesting revivals. Now, our church office meets at the Penn State Spiritual Center, and we are directly across the hall from an interesting group, the Penn State Neo-Pagans. and they don't interact with us much. I'm still praying for the day that I have the opportunity to sit down with one of them for lunch. I'm anticipating that that will happen eventually by God's grace. But you don't have to be at a college campus. Go to your local bookstore. Notice all of the books in prominent places on things like crystals and tarot cards and astral projection and all of this kind of revival of occult spirituality. But it's not just occult spirituality, it's also things that don't necessarily get labeled as spiritual, but which are kind of filling that niche in people's lives. There's a scholar, Elizabeth Tara Burton, wrote a book called Strange Rites. That's rites, R-I-T-E-S. And she talks about how we have this effect where many of the things that people engage in are kind of plugging the religious void in their lives, however imperfectly. So people become religious about K-pop fan culture or CrossFit or Penn State football, right? Or maybe they do venture into something like neo-paganism because it has a kind of rebellious sentiment to it. Or maybe they go for the alphabet soup of various sexual and gender identities and the communities that operate under those labels. There are all kinds of ways in which young people are trying to fill that void. And so one way that I like to think of our context is that it's like it's not a secular society in the old sense of using that word, but it really is a kind of pagan revival. We're less like, the modernist fantasy of this a-religious society, and much more like the world that St. Aidan of Lindisfarne inhabited when he went back to Northumbria after Christianity had, in a sense, receded from the places of influence in that culture. There's a quote by Louise Perry, who interestingly is not a Christian, but she wrote a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, kind of offering a feminist critique of the sexual revolution that in some ways lines up quite well with Christian morality, in other ways a little bit off, but she has an interesting perspective. And she says this: what if we understand the Christian era as a clearing in a forest? The forest is paganism, dark, wild, vigorous, and menacing, but also magical in its way. For 2,000 years, Christians pushed the forest back with burning and hacking, but also with pruning and cultivating, creating a garden in the clearing with a view upward to heaven. But watch as roots outstretch themselves and new shoots spring up from the ground. The patch of sky recedes. With no one left to tend the garden, the forest is reclaiming its ground. So this is an interesting way of thinking about evangelism. What we're doing essentially is not simply the work of going into this space where there's a state of neutrality or a lack of something and introducing the seed of the gospel. But what we're actually doing is clearing the garden, clearing the soil, removing the weeds so that the seed can be planted in fertile soil. The problem is that a lot of the soil in which we live is infertile. So not only is there a lack of gospel witness, but the environment itself lacks the conditions in which the gospel can take root and flourish. And what are some of the sources of these weeds? Well, I don't want to sound overly cynical about technology. I'm certainly not a Luddite, but we all have one of these. And for many of us, this is a tool. For Gen Z, even more so for Gen Alpha, the so-called iPad kids, this is a religious icon. It is a gateway into another world. We live in an attention economy, an economy that is trying to seize and to hold our attention, and through that to grip our hearts and move us in particular directions. Most often, I would say, for the sake of monetary gain. And we've seen the fruits of this, and they're not good. Gen Z Millennials, my generation too, even before them, but gets even worse the younger you get. There's been this experience of a rising crisis of anxiety. Since 2010, anxiety disorders have increased among young people by about 134%. Depression by about 106%. Students and youth are the worst affected, and Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a really interesting book that I recommend all of you read, it's called The Anxious Generation. He talks about the decline of play-based childhood and the rise of phone-based childhood, where the smartphone becomes a kind of numbing agent or adult pacifier. Earlier, when we were listening about formation in the family, I couldn't help but think that the unfortunate reality is that handing your kid a smartphone when he's fussing is probably the dominant, one of the dominant expressions of formation that kids are growing up with these days. And so attentions are increasingly colonized by corporations, by influencers, by people with ideas that are antithetical to our faith. Gen Z is the first generation to grow up fully online. I can at least remember the days of dial-up internet, and my students, as young as I am, they make fun of me for that. They think I'm old. I had a little FM radio sitting on my shelf in my apartment, and some students came over for dinner, and one of them walks up to the FM radio and says, "What's that?" Never seen it before. Pretty crazy. Luciano Floridi, who's scholar, philosopher of information at Oxford, he says that Generation Z may not conceive of life outside the infosphere because, to put it dramatically, the infosphere is progressively absorbing any other reality. Gen Z was born online. And so not only are attentions being colonized, but they're also growing shorter. Notice that Facebook is no longer popular among your kids, your grandkids, your peers. It's now things like TikTok, things that require much less attention. When I go to watch movies with young people, I often see that I can't even sit through an entire movie, but people have their phones out, they're watching their phones, multitasking in a sense, while the movie's playing in the background, right? So anxiety, colonization of our attention, also what's being called the epidemic of loneliness. Scholars are realizing that young people are increasingly lonely. There's actually been a significant decline in the numbers of young people in Gen Z who are sexually active outside of wedlock, but it's not because they're becoming more Christian in their sensibilities. It's because they're content to sit home and watch pornography. You know, this is the reality. People are lonely. Many students that I talk to are giving up hope of ever having a spouse or a family. And there's a process of healing that I have to go through very often in the context of my discipleship with them. And with this too, you have influencer culture, the rise of parasocial relationships. You know, think about the kinds of people that our voices listened to online. Some of these voices are very good. You know, you look at the increasing numbers of Christian, especially Catholic, Orthodox, and some Protestant apologists online. People like Gavin Ortland, Robert Barron, Jonathan Pageau, and others. There's a guy, Redeemed Zoomer, that is a friend of Joe, who runs the Young Anglican YouTube channel. And Redeemed Zoomer is able to get young people interested in theology just by playing a live stream of himself doing a video game called Minecraft while he talks about theology. And he builds churches inside this video game, Minecraft. It's really quite interesting. So in some ways, society is becoming more post-literate as a result of this. I have English professors in my church who are not allowed by the English department to assign books in some of their classes, believe it or not. And part of it is because students are arriving without the ability to read more than just short fragments of texts. So what does all of this mean? Well, it means that in the context of our evangelism, and especially when we think about evangelism to young people, to a context that's been so deeply affected by these technological changes, we need to, in a sense, do the work of healing alongside our proclamation of the gospel. We need to draw upon our Catholic spirituality, our disciplines of faith, right? To not only propagate the information, propositions of faith, right? But also to do the work of healing the attention, of healing the heart, of promoting stability in a world that feels like it's constantly changing. There's been a surge, promisingly, in conversions to a lot of more traditional forms of Christianity, like Catholicism and Orthodoxy, and I've seen it in an Anglican context too, where a lot of young people are looking around and they're realizing, gosh, I have nothing I can hold on to and build my life upon, nothing that will last. Where is the stability? Where can I plant my roots down deep? And so we have great resources to draw upon. In our church, I talk regularly about the healing power of prayer, the stability lent to our prayer life by the daily office. Joe mentioned in one of his questions earlier the Compline service that's run by one of our students, for students out of his apartment. For many of the people coming into our church, that's their first exposure to anything like Anglican liturgy. And what they find is that the way it engages the senses, the way that it engages us more holistically in the life of prayer, provides so much more than what they've experienced up to that point in terms of helping them connect to God. Because you have to move away those distractions. You have to get rid of all the other voices. What would it look like if we promoted the disciplines like silence, like contemplative prayer, like daily office, and made these the bread and butter of what we do? Well, blessing is you all are here. You are probably already doing many, if not all of these things. But consider how are we building bridges? How are we connecting with people for whom this is a foreign vocabulary, right? One of the things that I often think about is, what does it look like to have a bridge? If I have someone who I know is going to visit my church and have no clue what's going on, how do I connect with them first in an environment where people often don't have community? They don't necessarily have the relational capacity to just get plugged in voluntarily. Well, I like to use the idea of Jesus calls us fishers of men, right? Now, there are different ways you can go fishing. You can bring out your rod and your reel and cast into the lake. You can cast your net into the lake, or you can create fish ponds. You can have cultivated communities where people are engaging in your church life through hospitality, through maybe a more accessible form of prayer, like Compline as opposed to evening prayer, and then gradually begin to draw people deeper. This is an area where I've seen a lot of fruit. And I'm probably out of time. Okay, I'll just say one more thing, which is we need to be very intentional about how we as a church movement are engaging in online spaces. I mentioned Joe's Young Anglican YouTube channel. He did a survey several months ago, almost a year ago now, Joe, right? Yeah, and at that point in time, there were over 100 young people who had reported in that survey that they were now attending Anglican churches as a result of content they found on Joe's YouTube channel. This is becoming the front porch for us in terms of our outreach to Gen Z. We can't ignore that this is the landscape that we're in. So if we want to bring the gospel to the nations, and especially to those under 35, we need to be intentional about learning the kinds of skills to get our message into those spaces. So I'll close on that note. Thank you all so much.
Before you all bum rush the microphones with questions, take a breath. What if we don't know how to turn a computer on?
Well, I would say you learned how to tie your shoes, learn how to turn your computer on. Talk to someone young in your church who can teach you.
My dad would always make his coworkers upset because he would turn the computer off when he was done with it. And they would say, "What are you doing?" He says, "Well, that's what you do with stuff when you don't use it."
Yeah.
No.